Okay, good. Thanks for the introduction, Jake. May Allah bless you all. Jazakallah for the opportunity. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Well, my name is Hamza, and I wrote a book called The Divine Reality, and I did an MA in philosophy. My dissertation was on the hard problem of consciousness and other bits and pieces. And I'm continuing my postgraduate research at the University of London. And I have a particular interest in consciousness because I had a bit of an issue when I was around, I don't know, maybe 11 or 12 years old. I had this kind of existential crisis, not from the point of view of meaning or the point of view of, purpose in life. It was more a form of solipsism, which was, I had a realization, it just dawned on me that I was the only one aware of my own conscious awareness, and I wasn't aware of other people's conscious awareness at the same time that I'm aware of my own awareness. Now, that might be confusing. That might be a bit confusing, but that was extremely lonely. It just dawned on me. It was such a lonely thing that I think I started crying. I'll get slightly, contextually depressed because I felt like I was maybe the only one who really exists, right? Now, people may not empathize with this at all because they haven't had this experience. Alhamdulillah, thank God. But some people just have those experiences. And I think that was the kind of emotional, existential driver in order for me to try and explore the whole topic of consciousness a little bit more. And that's why I was very fascinated with the hard problem of consciousness. Now, as many of you may know or not know, the hard problem of consciousness in the philosophy of the mind is really based on two key questions. People think it's only one question, but in actual fact, it's two key questions. The first key question is, what is it like for a particular organism to have an inner subjective conscious experience? Okay. So I know I have inner subjective conscious experiences, and I know what it's like for me to have a hot chocolate on a Sunday looking at the sunset. But what about Jake's inner subjective conscious experience? Can I know what it's like for Jake to have a hot chocolate on a Sunday looking at the sunset? No, I just have my own. Now, it's subjectivity for sure. However, it is a first person fact. No one can deny the fact that they have an awareness of their own awareness, or they are undergoing or they're experiencing a form of phenomenal consciousness, because in the literature it's also called known as phenomenality or phenomenal experience, which basically means inner subjective conscious experience. So I may be able to describe my experience as warm, sweet, beautiful, and you may use exactly the same words, and we're thinking we're talking about the same type of inner subjective conscious experience, but in actual fact we still wouldn't know. Why? Because words are vehicles to meaning, and meaning is like a reflection, a mirror of that inner subjective conscious experience. So when I say warm and beautiful and amazing, I have a certain kind of experience that backs that up. That's personal to me, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Jake has exactly the same type of experience, even though he's using the same words.
Right.
So this is what you may call the epistemic gap. There's an epistemological gap, meaning there is a gap of knowledge. How do we bridge that gap under materialism? And by the way, when we use the word materialism in the philosophy of the mind, it's used synonymously with physicalism. Yes, they have two different histories. However, they really mean the following, that consciousness can be reduced to or is identical to physical processes. Materialism historically used to talk about bits of matter, but in the philosophy of the mind, in the literature, as far as I'm aware of it, that those two terms are used synonymously, and they're used in the context that we've just said, that all consciousness can be reduced to in some way or identical to physical processes. So that's the first question of the hard problem. The second question is not an epistemological question. It's not an epistemic question, because a lot of the naturalists, they say, oh, we're going to bridge the gap, right? We're going to bridge that gap. When we know the science, when we learn more science, we'll bridge it, which I think is a huge fallacious argument we could discuss later and unpack it later. But the point here is, they say we could bridge that gap, but they've misunderstood the hard problem, because the hard problem is not just an epistemic issue, it's an ontological issue, meaning the source and nature of reality. So the second question is, why And how do phenomenal experiences, meaning how and why do inner subjective conscious experiences arise from neurobiological processes? This has some epistemic issues, but it's also an ontological issue, given the fact that we have a kind of first-person fact sensation of what it's like to have inner subjective conscious experiences, and we know what kind of physical processes are supposed to be, because even according to the naturalists, physical processes are what? They're blind and non-conscious. What does that mean? Let's unpack that. When we say physical processes are blind, it means there is no intentional force directing them anywhere. When we say they're non-conscious, we're saying physical processes do not have something called intentionality. I know that's a massive issue in the philosophy of the mind. There's lots of ikhtilaf, as they say, differences of opinion. But just to break it down in a simple way, intentionality is about aboutness. Yeah. For example, I'm looking at my mobile phone. My stream of consciousness now is about something other than what's in here. It's outside. It's about something else. Physical processes, by definition, are not about anything. They're not even about themselves. They just are cold and non-conscious from that perspective. So one would argue, if that's the ontology of physicalism, which also relates to philosophical naturalism, then how can we have inner subjective conscious experiences arise from seemingly cold and non-conscious physical processes? It's like, whoa, right? So how do they try and answer these questions? So let me go backwards. The first way they try to answer this question, especially from the kind of atheistic perspective, is science, neuroscience, neurobiological studies. It's going to solve the problem. Now, with all due respect, right? With all due respect, neuroscience is predicated on a philosophical assumption. This is well known. If you read the works of Rex Wilson, Antti Revoncio, Manzotti, Moderato, blah, 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 the philosophers of the mind and even neuroscientists themselves understand that neurobiological studies, neuroscience, it assumes physicalism. So all neurobiological studies can do is basically give you a physicalistic approach or a materialistic approach to this question. And by definition, it won't really solve the problem, because it will be always assuming physicalism to be true. What we're trying to show now is, well, is physicalism true? Is materialism or physicalism the correct philosophy of the mind to understand the reality of consciousness, right? They can't even start dealing with that question, because all neurobiological studies are basically predicated on this philosophical assumption, which is physicalism. So neuroscience will never be able to address this issue, because neuroscience, generally speaking, is a study of correlations. As one of my friends who did a master's in neuroscience, he called it pixelated phrenology. Yeah, the phrenology is the study of the brain. It's pixelated phrenology. And listen to this. This is my challenge. Even if we're to map out the entirety of Jake's brain, right? Say we map it out, and we can correlate every single pattern and the minutiae, the differences, and correlate them to inner subjective conscious experiences, and correlate those to his utterances of the descriptions of his inner experiences, it still won't solve the problem. It will still won't answer both questions. It won't answer, okay, well, what is it like for Jake to undergo a particular inner subjective conscious experience? We just have his descriptions, right? Right. But what is it like? And we won't be able to answer the question, well, how on earth does he have this inner subjective conscious experience arising from seemingly cold, blind physical processes? So even if neuroscience were to map everything in the brain, because this is one of the arguments from the atheist, look, man, when we know everything about the brain, we'll know everything about consciousness. Whoa. That would only make sense if you're an eliminative materialist, right? But we could discuss that a bit later. So neuroscience can't really deal with the problem. And I've got something here from Professor, I forgot his name now. He's from King's College University in London. He actually articulated a really powerful undercutting defeater to people who claim that neuroscience is actually, if we know more about the brain, we'll know more about consciousness from the point of view of inner subjective conscious experiences. So he makes a really beautiful point here. It's Papineau, the Professor Papineau.
Yeah.
I think his name is David Papineau. He presents a really nice argument. I want to summarize the argument for you. It's just 7 statements. So he says, number 1, and I'm paraphrasing, a neurochemical event E is identical with the conscious experience P. Number 2, E cannot be absent when P is testified to be present. 3, E cannot be present when P is testified to be absent. 4, E must be present to be necessary for P. 5, E is sometimes absent when P is testified to be present. 6, E is sometimes present when P is testified to be absent. 7, conclusion, therefore E is not necessary for P. So his conclusion is that the neurochemical event E is not necessary for inner subjective conscious experience P. Because when you do a study of all the neurobiological correlations, you will see that sometimes the neurobiological event E is not always present for a particular P. And sometimes it's absent, sometimes it's present, and so on and so forth. So it shows that the correlations they have found so far are not necessary for P, which is a really interesting argument by Papineau. Now, I've gone too long. I don't want to take too much time. So I just want to mention what are the physicalist claims. So I'm not going to go into them and refute them. I think we should do that together.
Right.
So one approach is what you would call eliminative materialism, okay? And one would argue that the Churchlands had this view, Dennett had this view in 1991. He wrote the book Consciousness Explained. Some philosophers said that book should have been called Consciousness Explained Away, because he doesn't deal with the questions of the hard problem of consciousness. He just thinks that we're just like, robots. We don't have any consciousness, right?
Yeah.
So it's eliminative materialism, which basically says that there is no consciousness. That's essentially what they're saying. And we could unpack what it means and unpack and how we can address that during the podcast today. And by the way, a lot of the empirical neurobiological studies that have fancy names, right? There are so many fancy names for many different, the neuro correlations and all of that fancy names, right? All of these things still have these approaches as their philosophical assumptions. So it's very important to deal with the philosophical assumptions, because the kind of minutiae of the empirical neurobiological study is interesting, but it's really predicated on these approaches anyway. So one is eliminative materialism. The other one is reductive materialism, which basically says it doesn't deny inner subjective conscious experience, but it says that the brain, or our understanding of science or understanding of the brain, would eventually close the gap, and we'll be able to understand that consciousness can be explained or reduced to physical processes in some way. So they don't say individual process or individual bits of matter. They will say, you can reduce it to physical processes in some way. Then we could discuss why that fails.
Right.
The other physicalist approach, which is very popular, is called functionalism. Functionalism, just to really make you understand this, is like a mirroring a computer system. You have inputs, mental states, and outputs. And they say when you have an input, for example, your bus is coming, right? And your mental state is, oh my God, I'm going to be late, right? You have the inner subjective conscious experience, so I'm actually late. And then the output is that you start running for your bus. So there is a connection between inputs, outputs, and mental states. But as you know, that doesn't even answer any of the problems of the problems of consciousness. But we could address that later. Another view, well, probably the final main physicalist view, is what you call emergent materialism, which is getting quite popular. And there are 2 forms of emergent materialism. You have strong emergent materialism and weak emergent materialism. Strong emergent materialism says, look, consciousness exists, but it's based on complex physical processes, and these physical processes have complex causal relations, and it's impossible to unravel them. And they said to try and understand it, it's equivalent of putting, for example, Darwin's book on the origin of species in a hamster's cage, thinking the hamster's going to understand its origins, right? It's an interesting point, but it's a failed point, because all they're doing, they're really assuming some type of physicalism like reductive materialism anyway, or reductive materialism. And it's a bit of a cop-out, and we could discuss later why that's the case. The other version, which is called weak emergent materialism, which basically says yes, it's based on complex physical processes, and these physical processes have complex causal relations. When we unravel them, we will be able to understand subjective consciousness. But really, that's not a philosophy in itself. That's reductive materialism. You're assuming reductive materialism to be true. And if you've dealt with reductive materialism, then you've dealt with weak emergence. And they give you things like, what about water? You have the molecules of oxygen and hydrogen, and they combine together to give you properties that don't exist in the original individual processes. That's what emergent materialism basically says, that you're going to get something, an emergent property like consciousness, and the properties of consciousness cannot be found in the individual processes or in the physical system that is causally related and causally connected. And they say, look, this exists in science anyway. Look at water, H2O. You have hydrogen, you have oxygen, and you put them together and they causally relate in some way, and you have properties of water that don't belong to the individual molecules, for example, the individual atoms, hydrogen atoms, oxygen atoms, right? So you have water that is shiny and it's a transparent liquid, but those properties cannot be found in the individual processes themselves, which we know that example is a really bad example for many reasons, which we could discuss. So those are the main type of physicalist ontologies, if you like, or the physicalist approaches to the mind. And I would argue from this, we could even talk about God's existence from the hard problem of consciousness, but that's maybe for another day. Sorry for waffling, but that's the introduction.
Oh, no, that was great.
No. It was a great introduction. Really do appreciate it. So as far as what I understood you saying, Brother Hamza, is that there's two main problems with consciousness and materialism. One is an ontological problem, and one is an epistemological problem. And then you went over various different possible responses that are offered in the literature in philosophy of mind from a materialist or physicalist paradigm. And then you explain some of the issues or potential issues with each one of those responses to the two problems that you mentioned. So I think that was a great intro to explaining sort of the foundations for the discussion. I do want to point out to the audience that we are going to spend a little bit more time on the introduction portion of this, because it is a bit more in depth and kind of gets in the weeds a little bit philosophically. So we want to lay the groundwork for the discussion before we invite guests on. And we're probably going to shoot for maybe around 45 minutes to an hour to when we start to invite guests on. But yeah, once again, Hamza, I do appreciate that intro. Now, Brother Sharif, I want to hear what your thoughts are on the question: can materialism actually account for or ground consciousness? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think Brother Hamza's mentioned a lot of points and really covered the subject area comprehensively, it seems, on this. How I also see it is, when we look at the issue of consciousness, what we're asking is, how is it that non-physical things become self-aware, have this internal experience? How do physical, non-conscious things have this internal experience? That's the first question we're trying to work out. The second question is, okay, how do we approach that? How can we analyze the internal experiences of something that's physical? What do we do? So normally the scientists will say, well, we'll use science to try to investigate that. And I think, as Hamza's mentioned, and also yourself, Jake, is that there is a problem. There's like an in-principle problem. The in-principle problem is this. Let me give you an example. If I've got a color red, I thought this bottle was red, but it's actually more purple. But if I've got this purple Ribena, shouldn't be showing that. We're not sponsored by them. So if we've got this, which is sort of a purpley color, we experience it as purple, Now, science, what's science going to tell us about this? Science is going to say, well, it has a particular reflection of light at a specific wavelength and a specific energy. It will tell me the properties of the light. None of those properties are related to my experience. So there's an experience, there's an attribute that I'm sensing, which is not physical for the light itself. Yeah, it goes beyond the light, in essence, beyond the physical. So what science is going to tell me is going to give me a third-person objective analysis of some reality. But consciousness, my experience of this, is a first-person subjective experience. And there's nothing about the reflection of the wavelength of light and its energy that tells me I will experience it as being purple or red or whatever color. There's another problem. If I have a person who's been blind from birth and I try to describe that color, this color here, there is no language, there's no descriptive way to describe the color to the person who's never seen it. Yeah. So we've got another problem in terms of being able to describe something because the language doesn't exist because it is first person experience, which means if you've not experienced it or I've not experienced it, there's no way of being able to describe it because there's nothing in the property that allows us to describe it as the experience that we're having. And that's not just like color, that's everything else as well. Taste, pain, as Hamza mentioned, having a coffee on a sunset after Maghrib, maybe with Salah and stuff like that. So, this is so these things we don't any experience. It's these things we can't describe because the quality is not in the object. Yeah, it's within our own mind. So the question then becomes, well, how do I access the mind? Now, some people say, well, as Hamza mentioned about this correlation, about how the brain states tells us, if we work out the brain states, we can work out the correlation. Yeah. And this is the analogy that, strikes home to me is if I had ones and zeros, which are binary code for computer programs. Yeah. Now, there's nothing in the ones and zeros that tells me what the computer program is. You need something that occurs before the computer program, and that's the mind. That's the conscious ability to interpret the ones and zeros. It's like Morse code, dashes and dots. The dashes and dots are not going to give me information. What's going to give me information is the fact that I can interpret the dashes and dots into a language that I can understand. So I need a mind before the signals, whether that's signals in the brain, the action potentials and the neurons, or whether that is the ones and zeros on a computer. I need something that has already existed separate from the actual code in order to interpret the code. And the third example, or the third problem, is even if people are able to point to and say, okay, this neuron or these group of neurons in the brain, if they fire, they'll make you perceive the color purple. Yeah. But the problem is that the ability to say, well, okay, they're firing, how does that make it purple? It's like, and this is an example that Professor Donald Hoffman said, it's like you've got a bottle and you rub the bottle. Yeah. You rub the bottle and a genie pops out. Yeah. Okay, fine. We rub the bottle. Yeah. And the genie pops out every time. But you're not going to say that the bottle is causative of the genie. You're going to say, well, this phenomenon is occurring and I can't necessarily connect the two. Yeah. And that's what's happening in regards to the hard problem of consciousness is the inability to, have the tools in science to access it. There's nothing within the properties of the reality or the brain that tells us how we're going to experience a reality. And even if we're able to show a correlation between the nerves and the neurons in the brain, we still don't have the ability to explain how this first person subjective experience comes about.